Good morning, everybody. Sorry for the short delay for starting the webinar this morning. We are just waiting actually for one more of our presenters today. So I'll just wait a couple of minutes to let people join in, and then I'll start heading through some introductions and some housekeeping shortly. So do just bear with us for a second, and it won't be too long before we get started. Just so everybody can check that they are in the right place. So we are doing a session today that is all about the grant funding application process versus the public procurement contracts or tenders process. So that's what we're covering today, grants versus tenders, to hopefully give some useful information. The whole session will last no longer than an hour. We're aiming for around 45 minutes. So hopefully that will cover what everybody needs in that time. So I can see quite a few people have joined us. I will get started with introductions and housekeeping. So firstly, I just wanted to say good morning and welcome everybody to the session. Thank you for joining us today for this session on grants and tenders. My name is Gillian Askew. I'm one of 3 co-founders of a company called Go for Growth, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that later on in the webinar. But I will be your host for today's session. I'm joined by Andrew Towning from Nottingham City and Nottinghamshire Violence Reduction Partnership. And we are due also today to be joined by Roy Towler from BlueLight Commercial organisation. And I'll ask those guys to just do a quick introduction in a second when I've got through some housekeeping. So in terms of housekeeping, firstly, to let you know that the session is being recorded. You will get a copy of the recording. You'll be able to get that a couple of ways. So you'll be able to find a copy of the recording on the Go for Growth YouTube channel. That's likely to be in our bids playlist, but you'll be able to find that anywhere in our YouTube channel. But we will also send a copy of the recording out to everybody that's registered to join us today. We'll also email you a copy of the slide deck, so try not to worry too much if about taking notes as we go along, because you will get a copy of the pack. And any links that we reference throughout the session today, they'll also be sent to you in the pack. So any live links that are in there that will be useful to use, we'll send you those so you can just link straight through to them. As always, we are on Zoom, so there is a chat and a Q&A function. Please do feel free to use both. We have put some time aside for questions and answers at the end, but feel free to throw questions into the Q&A as we go through the presentation. If we can, we'll either try and answer them as they come up, or we'll try and answer them at the end if we can't do that as we go. In the unlikely event that we can't get through the questions in the session today, we will take those questions away and we'll answer them and post the answers back through with the email when we send the slide deck out later. If you want to say hi and introduce yourself, feel free to use the chat function in Zoom. I think there is a functionality in chat where you need to check who you want to see your chat, and I think it's a choice of hosts and panelists or everyone, so just make sure you've got it set to who you want to say hi to. If I could ask people to use the Q&A for any actual questions about anything we're covering, that would be dead useful, but I will try and keep an eye on both. And welcome, Roy. I can just see that you've joined us from BlueLight Commercial, and that's perfectly timed because I was just about to ask yourself and Andrew to do a quick introduction before we move on to the agenda.
Yes,
Roy, can I come to you first?
Yeah, morning. Apologies for being a couple of minutes late. I managed to join a Teams meeting instead of this one, so sorry for that. Yeah, my name is Roy Towler. I'm a commercial lead for BlueLight Commercial, and we've got a slide in a little while just to go through what BlueLight Commercial is all about.
Perfect, thank you. And Andrew, could I ask you to say hi?
Hi everybody, my name's Andrew Towning from the Nottingham City and Nottinghamshire VRP. I help run the incubation hub, which I'll tell you more about later. Looking at the participants here, I think a lot of you would have met me before or have correspondence with me, but I'll be able to introduce myself to you properly later. I'm afraid I've got a bit of a spring cold, which has left me with the complexion of an oversteamed ham, so I won't be having my camera on today. But what do you call it? But I'll try and introduce myself as well as I can, and I'll work nonetheless.
No problem. Thank you very much, both of you. So this is the agenda for today. What I will say is there's an awful lot to cover today, so it will be quite high level. If you do want any further information outside of the session, please don't hesitate to get in touch with any of us. We'll do our best to help. If it's Go for Growth you're coming to, our contact details will be on a slide later down the PAP. So again, please feel free to just get in touch if we can help you. First up on the agenda today, as Roy said, it's Roy from BlueLight Commercial, so I'll hand over to you if that's okay. Thank you, Roy.
Right, good morning everybody. As I said, my name is Roy Towler. I am a commercial lead with an organisation called BlueLight Commercial. Although we are set up as a company, we are funded and were established by the Home Office just short of 3 years ago. Technically, we are owned by all the police and crime commissioners across the 43 forces in England and Wales, and we provide commercial services, and we class it as membership. So members within the BlueLight community includes all the English and Welsh 43 forces. There are various policing bodies that we also serve, such as National Crime Agency, College of Policing, British Transport Police, etc. But we've also got one or two overseas bodies involved as well. Jersey Police Authority and the Royal Gibraltar Police. So I seem to be referencing mainly police at the moment, but several police and crime commissioners also have fire under their remit. So we are engaging more and more with fire services, and also the BlueLight will engage with sort of the ambulance and NHS at some point. We've got a comms and expansion strategy that's laid out, but primarily our initial focus is around the police environment. We provide commercial support both nationally and at force level. So we have various national contracts that BlueLight have put in place to do with fleet and uniforms. We've even got a team that are looking at services around victim support. And at force level, before I joined the aviation part of BlueLight, I was working directly supporting Nottinghamshire Police, bringing their procurement function back in-house. So we do, have a mix of coverage nationally and locally. We also provide non-commercial support, and a key one at the moment that we are working on is to do with social value, and we will be providing more and more engagement and training and support for SME and BCSE sort of environment on that. I believe you're going to get copies of the slides, so I've actually left on there a link to a social value action planning tool, which BlueLight fund, so there's no cost to this, and it is a very, very good tool, and it's also useful for any organisations that's looking at the wider public sector work. This is not just a tool and a site that's focused purely on the police environment. It helps you map out and develop as a small supplier any action plans relating to social value, which isn't an initiative that is it's here to stay, and it's actually growing in importance across the wider public sector. So it is a useful thing to try and develop on that. And like I said, we will be working through organisations such as with Jill and Go for Growth, providing more support in key areas such as social value.
Perfect, that's brilliant. Thank you ever so much, Roy. If we get started on grants versus tenders, I'm not going to dwell too much on this first slide, but I thought it was a good reminder of why the public sector is a good potential customer. And I think there's three elements to this. So the size and the stability, more importantly, of the market. It's a big market, 280, 300 billion per year of on goods and services. And there really is almost certainly something for everyone in the public sector, whether that's through a grant funding application route or through a contracts route. And there's a real genuine drive and ambition to place more business with the voluntary sector, with the VCS, and with smaller organisations, including micro organisations and sole traders. And that's really been reflected in the new regulations. So post-Brexit, the UK is putting together their own public procurement regulations, which will generally, I think, be assented to law sometime next year, probably springtime next year. But when they come into place next year, there is much more emphasis on removing barriers to entry. And I think that's really great news for the voluntary sector market and for smaller organisations. And there's a real focus on local economic development. So things like the levelling up agenda, anchor institution strategy, widening participation, all of those things, along with that drive to remove barriers and in a stable and growing market, can mean it's a really good time to work within the public sector as a provider. So let's start with the grant funding process today. There are some common guidances with grants. Some of the things that I talk through will be quite similar both for grants and for public sector contracts, and I'll try and pull those out where it's appropriate. On this screen, for example, we talk about word counts or page counts that might be in play. They're likely to be in play both for a grant funding application and almost certainly for a procurement application. We would always recommend that you obviously adhere to the word and page counts, and I'll talk a little bit more about what happens if you don't later in the presentation. But in addition, always read the guidance documents that come out with any funding application. In the case of grants, there'll be a funding criteria, and that will enable you to determine whether you would qualify for that funding or not. And doing that first can often save an awful lot of time. Usually for grants, and it's the same with contracts, the application process will be an online process, a digital process. Typically, you won't be asked to post documents off anymore. It'll all be done through an online kind of process. And you'll be able to attach any evidence-typed documents that you need to submit as part of that online application process. Where grants will differ from contracts is that generally in a grant application, you'll be telling a story about how you will use the funding to deliver the outcomes that you have identified. Whereas in a contract, you'll be talking about how your goods and services can fulfill the specification that the contracting authority has identified, and you'll be doing that through a question set. Also with grants, and where this differs slightly, is you're likely to be able to talk to funders or funding facilitators about your project during the window of open applications. In contracts, of course, you will be able to ask questions in relation to the competition itself, but what you wouldn't be able to do is discuss your project or your business and how it works, whereas actually that's often encouraged in the grant application form. And there's a link on the screen. Nottinghamshire PCC, the Police and Crime Commissioner, have published some guidance, and it's actually really good guidance. So if you want to go and have a look at that guidance, there is some really helpful stuff in there. So we would definitely encourage a read of that. As it says on the screen at the top, every grant will differ. So what we're trying to do today is give some generalizations. So you might find yourself in a grant application process where they're not asking for some of these things, and that's okay. But generally speaking, this is where you'll need to be. So generally speaking, you'll need to be a not-for-profit organisation. Although actually we're seeing more and more funding for social enterprises now. You might see in a grant funding application that you need to have at least 3 unrelated trustees or directors, or you might have to have a management committee in place. And we have seen grant funding applications where there might be an expectation that no one single trustee or director will have more than 50% control of that organisation. In contracts, you will often be asked about persons of significant control, but in grants, actually, there might be an expectation that you don't qualify if you've got somebody who has more than 50% control. I've been asked a few times by people who are wanting to submit a grant application on behalf of their organisation about where you find the information on persons of significant control. And it's the same for registered businesses as it is for charities. You should be able to find that information at Companies House. Charities are obliged to file each year an updated list of persons of significant control. So you should be able to find that information at Companies House. If you can't, of course, go back to your management committee and ask the question. Your memorandum and articles should also show quite clearly how your organisation, whatever that constitution is, how that business is managed. For example, if you're a social enterprise, it should be clear in the memorandum and articles how you will treat profit if you make it. And it should be clear how you will make a social contribution. So this social impact should be the main focus of your organisation. That's a public declaration, and you should be measuring yourself and be measured against that social impact. In both grants and in contracts, in some way, shape or form, you'll be asked about your financial standing. For grants, you might be asked to have a bank account in the company name. Some funders might require you to have 2 individual unrelated signatories for that bank account. And you will definitely need to demonstrate your financial standing, and you will also be asked how you will manage the grant money if you're successful in that grant application. And depending on the type of grant that you are applying for, there might be restrictions on what you can use the money for. So some grants won't allow you to use the funding towards salaries or general overhead running of a project or an organisation. Some will cover capital items, buildings, etc. Some won't. So be clear on any restrictions on how you could use the funding, and make it clear how you will be using the budget in accordance to that. And if there is match funding that's been asked for in a grant funding application, you may well be asked to demonstrate where that match funding is coming from. Of course, if you're applying for unrestricted funding, then it is up to you how and when you use that funding. And in the case of both grants and contracts, you will likely be asked about core or key policies that are in place. For example, in grants, if it was successful with the funding, and that would mean that you were working with children or vulnerable adults, for example, it's likely that you would need a safeguarding policy to accompany your grant application. So these top tips were actually put together by some grant facilitators at a roadshow that I did, a series of roadshows. There were 5 of them in Bradford just recently, and I thought they were super helpful actually as top tips for grants, and wanted to include them today. I'm not going to read through everything that's on the screen. That's not, you can have a read through at your leisure, and if you've got any questions on anything, obviously do just give us a shout. But one of the things that funders talked a lot about at that roadshow series was point number 4, about have you done your research? And what they were saying was often funders got similar applications for grants in a geographical area from organisations who were doing similar things, but who potentially didn't even know about each other, never mind were working together. And that situation can be quite difficult for funders to determine where funding should go. So they were really keen to say, in terms of research, things to include in your application are, what are you doing that's different? What is the gap that your project would fill? How have you determined the need for what you're suggesting the project would do? And who else nearby is doing anything similar? Or, you know, are there any related services that you could tap into and collaborate with? Those things go down really well in grant funding applications. And funders and funding facilitators at that roadshow were always really keen to talk about balance. And what I mean is that funders are trying to strike a balance. And they're trying to strike a balance between ongoing funding for continued provision of services versus funding new services and funding new innovations that come through. And that obviously is a really difficult balancing act, because if something's working, they want to keep it going, but also they want to have room in funding applications for new people to come through. So funders were keen to let applicants know that they do try and manage that balancing act. Be clear on your finances. Obviously, have a budget and know where you will spend the money, and know what value for money per beneficiary means, and write that down. Having said that, one of the things that the funders at that roadshow really wanted to reassure applicants was that they are real world viewpoints. So they understand that the reality of the project might differ from the application for the project. So you won't necessarily be held to the exact £1 going where you said you would put it and spend it in the application. You will be held, however, to the outcomes that you've talked about. But if there's anything that would impact the mix of that budgetary use, or if there's going to be any time delays or any overspends or anything like that, the advice is talk early, communicate well, talk to the funder, build a relationship with that funder. they're really there to help. So communicate as well as you can. And make sure you don't forget anything. And that sounds like a really obvious thing to say, but we all do it. I work in bids all the time, and it's very easy to forget to attach a relevant document, or I know in my head that there's a piece of crucial information. Have I written it down in my application? You can, as I said, probably discuss the project with funding facilitators whilst the application process is ongoing, but ultimately you'll be judged on the application that you put in, and usually they'll go to a panel of some sort. So that panel can only judge the application and what's written down in front of them. So if there's any missing information, that will be harder for them to grant the grant to you, and will likely hinder your chances at being successful. So if we move on from grants to the public sector contracts process, what I've tried to do is break it down into core elements. And there's 5 elements that you can see on screen. I'm going to go into some of these in a little bit more detail later on, but we start with the standard selection questionnaire, SSQ. In any public procurement, the SSQ will need to be completed, and there are 8 sections in the standard selection questionnaire. But the size, the sector, the complexity of the procurement opportunity will determine how much of that SSQ is required. For example, if the light touch regime is being utilised for social care, it might be a reduced selection questionnaire. In any procurement, there'll be a specification. We're going to talk about specification in a bit more detail, but basically it's a description of what the contracting authority wants to buy. There'll also be an evaluation criteria that is about how the responses will be scored, and how much each question is worth. And there's usually a weighting for those questions, and I'll talk through those in a little bit more detail. You'll have quality and technical questions to answer. I'm going to cover those in a little bit. And there'll also be legal terms and conditions. And in some public procurements, they can be a pretty weighty tome, to be fair. Our advice would always be to read the legal terms and conditions carefully and ask any questions that you have to the contracting authority through the clarification process. And I'll explain the clarification question process in a moment. But if you're a member of an organisation like your local chambers of commerce or the Federation of Small Businesses, for example, you'll have access to legal support. So you can ask any questions on the legal terms and conditions that you might have through there. Go for Growth has also recently just done 4 lunch and learn sessions on bid skills, and one of them was dedicated to legal terms and conditions, and we've pulled out the core clauses that will be in any contract. So exit termination, pricing clauses, IPR, things like liability, that kind of thing. So we'll send a link out to it with the slide deck, but it's not legal advice, but it is practitioner knowledge. Give it a watch if you want to increase your knowledge on some terms and conditions. And then finally, there's the feedback process. So all bidders will be notified whether you are successful or unsuccessful. And if it's the latter, what you should get is your score versus the winning score. And hopefully you should get some pretty detailed feedback explaining why your score was your score and the difference between that and the winning bidder's score. And that's to help you to be able to build on that and learn from that. And it's worth pointing out that the new regulations are proposing a change to that area of feedback. And again, one of the lunch and learn sessions that we did in Go for Growth was dedicated to feedback. So we'll also send the link out for that, so you can have a watch. They're only 20 minutes long, so they're dead short. So you can have a watch of those if that would be helpful for you. Just check if we've got any questions yet. No, we're doing okay at the minute. Everyone's still with us, which is good news. So I'm going to dive into the specification into a bit more detail, and forgive me if this is obvious to everybody, but the specification is, like I've said before, a description of what the contracting authority wants to buy, and it is a really crucial document in any bid. Our advice, and the way we do it when we're bidding, is that one of the first jobs that you do is read through that specification thoroughly. I would advise that you would make a note of any questions that might come out of reading that specification for the customer, and you would use the clarification process for that. So the clarification process in a procurement is done via the portal. So that would be EU supply, if that was with BlueLight Commercial, for example. And there's a messaging service in that portal. Any questions that you have about the procurement competition, you ask them through that portal, and then the contracting authority publishes the answers to those questions. So if you've got any questions on the specification, get them in as early as you can through the messaging service, the clarification process. You can also make a note of any evidence that you might have that you'll be able to use through the tender process. And crucially, you can make a note of any gaps that you might have in being able to deliver the specification. And our advice, and again, what we do is we need to think about those gaps, if you have got any gaps on that specification, and think about how substantial they are and whether those gaps mean that you should submit a bid or not. So you can have a think about how much of that specification that you can fulfill. And when you're completing the quality or technical questions, the answers that you give to those questions should relate back to the specification. So that specification is going to be at play throughout the procurement. Basically, the questions are testing your ability to deliver what's needed, and the specification is where they define what's needed. So referencing the parts of the specification the question relates to will help you to enhance your scores, hopefully. I can see we've just got a question. Oh, it looks like the chat is disabled. I've had that a couple of times now. I'm really sorry about that, Tanya. If you want to make any comments, please just pop them in Q&A. Not everybody will be able to see that, I don't think, but if you want to put anything in there, do feel free. So if I move on to evaluation criteria, every competitive process, regardless of value, should have within it how the award will be made. How are you successful? Usually there'll be sliding scales of scores, so it might be 0 to 100, 1 to 5, etc. And there should be details in the documentation about what each score means and what you would need to be including to get which score. And weightings denote, if there's 100% of scores available, for example, the weighting denotes how important that particular question is. So you might have 3 questions, question 1 with a weighting of 50, question 2 with a weighting of 30, question 3 with a weighting of 20. You can see that question 1 is the most important, and that will help you to determine where you want to put your effort and focus your effort in it. And there might be minimum thresholds, so you might have to reach a minimum score in order to be able to continue to go through the procurement. So I've got a slide with some examples actually about answering questions, but on this slide what I really wanted to talk about was redaction. So what happens if you don't answer the question correctly, or if you go over the page count or word count that's detailed there in the top tip. If, for example, there's a page count, you'll find that there's usually a font size that's specified. So if it says 3 pages of Arial font 11, make sure that you only submit a maximum of 3 pages of Arial font size 11. If it says 1,000 words, don't go over 1,000 words. Use as much of it as you can without waffling, but don't exceed it. What happens if you exceed them is they are simply redacted, and that means that they cut it out. So it won't be included in your bid. So if you submitted 4 pages, the 4th page wouldn't be evaluated. Worst case scenario, it could be classed as a non-compliant bid. So these instructions in a procurement are really important. And one of the first jobs that happens in evaluation can be governance checks. So there might be somebody who is checking word count, page count, making sure that all the documents that are required to be uploaded are uploaded, etc. So I do talk about it a lot, word counts and page counts, because often it is an area where people do go over. So do just think about that. And what I've got on screen are some actual questions. And again, forgive me if what I'm about to tell you feels just really obvious. I work in bids for a living, and often it's easy to get carried away with what we're writing, and especially if we're passionate about what we're doing. And so these are real questions that were set by a real contracting authority a few months ago. And in essence, what I've tried to do is highlight in yellow the doing elements of the question. And there are 5 elements in there. So in question 1, it's all about care plans. And what the contracting authority wants to know is how those care plans are individually tailored, how they're person-centred and meet the needs and outcomes of the person, how the care plans are kept up to date, how they're measured to ensure that people are involved in care planning, and how they link with partners to ensure that needs are met. So there's 5 core parts of that question. We would physically tick off answering those bits of the question in our response. So that helps you to know that you are answering all of the question. And you would be relating that back to the specification. So you would be checking what the specification says about care plans specifically and relating that back. And you would be evidencing your answer as much as you possibly could. On this particular one, the things in green are the restrictions. So on that first question, for example, 600 words, no attachments are allowed. So you're not going to be uploading any specific evidentiary documents, but you'll be weaving in evidence of how you meet the specification through answering that question. And you can see that as the weightings get lower, so the third one is for information only, the word count gets lower. Again, that helps you to understand that you're going to get the most points and highest score for question 1. So that's where you really want to place most of your focus. One thing I do want to point out, and you might know this, but you might not, whatever you write down in your response, if you're successful, that becomes legally binding. It becomes contractualized. So what it means is that you will be obliged legally to deliver against what you've written down. So what you should be writing down is what you do or what you can do, the evidences of that, but make sure that what you do write down isn't so wildly aspirational that you wouldn't be able to deliver it if you were successful in your bid, because you will be held to account for it. Now, Go for Growth, some time ago now, asked 10 public sector organisations what they thought the common pitfalls were that providers can commonly fall foul of, and it's really easy done. It's a club that we all belong to, and it's a club that we all want to get out of. And I'm not going to go through all 10 on the session today, but I'm going to try and pick a few out that we haven't covered already. The first one, not answering the question, feels again just really obvious, but often it isn't actually. Often we can get carried away, and especially if there is something that we really want to tell the potential clients, but they haven't quite asked us about, so we're trying to weave that information into a question. You saw when Roy was chatting to us that they're focusing on social value, but you might not always get asked about social value, for example, very explicitly, but you might really want to talk about your social contribution. My advice is don't try and weave other things into a question if you haven't been asked about it. Answer the question, use the word count, but answer the question and make sure that you're confident that you've answered that question and nothing else. Caveating is really difficult for contracting authorities. Bids received with caveats in them, for example, it will be this price if this happens, or this price if this happens, and it's not a scenario-based pricing. It can always make it really difficult and a bit awkward for the contracting authority. If you feel like you might have to caveat, generally speaking, there's probably a question that you could be asking the contracting authority. So again, our advice would be, if there's something that you feel requires a caveat, is there a question that you could ask the contracting authority that would mean you wouldn't need to do that caveating, because caveating is just really tough. The pick out number 5, reusing previous bids. I'm a great fan of using and reusing information. We shouldn't have to do everything from scratch every time. That it's a tough ask in terms of time, and especially in the VCS and in smaller organisations, time is a really precious commodity. So there's nothing wrong with using or reusing previous responses. However, it comes with a health warning. You do obviously need to make sure that that answer remains relevant and proportionate to this particular response, but also make sure that you've removed any references to other clients or other bids, that kind of thing. So check, double check and triple check that it is right and relevant to use that previous response. I'm going to pick out assumptions. In some contracts, you could be the incumbent, for example, so people might be really familiar with what you do. Don't assume that whoever will score you, even if they know you, could take any of that into account. They absolutely can't. It's not allowed in law. So you can only be judged on what you've written down. So don't make any assumptions. Don't use things like acronyms, that kind of thing. Don't assume that somebody would understand what that acronym means, because they may not. So if you want them to know something, take that evaluator on a journey. Andrew, I can see you've got your hand up.
Yeah, can I just back you up on that, Jill? Yeah, I beg you to take that particular one into account. The amount of applications I have to go through, and people say stuff like, we believe our experience with the VRP speaks for itself. It doesn't, it can't. Yeah. And we're and it's very painful for us, because we know that if you put that down, it would make you a shoo-in. You know what I mean? Because you've done lots of projects with us before, and and you've got all the experience that we need for a given thing. But it's like Jill said, by law, we need to treat everybody the same. Every new bidding process is like a clean slate. So don't be afraid of telling us what you think we already know, because we have to act like we don't.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, I'll pick up something you said then, Andrew. Like, we believe our service is fit for purpose. The question would always be, well, how? So when you're writing your response, that evidencing of what you're writing down is really important. So it's okay to say, we think we're brilliant. You've got to have a because at the end of it, or we think that we can do something amazing. You have to have the so what of that. So all the way through your application, whether it's for a grant or for a contract, think about the so what, why, what, all of those things, because that's what the evaluator will need to see. Roy, did you have your hand up then? Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. I was going to say that, yeah, number 9, the assumptions, is probably one of the most common one that I've ever come across in 30 years of procurement, especially for incumbents. And it just comes across as, lazy is probably a strong word, but it is a pitfall you want to avoid. Another common one as well is that often where a question relates to something that you might have detailed within a document, say a policy or a strategy, sometimes people won't answer the question. They'll just say see attached and then put that document on there. Again, I would recommend not doing that. At least try and, even if you do provide the attachment to supplement it, at least make the effort to answer the question initially.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think if you look at when the slide deck comes out, breaking down the doing elements of the question it's been so helpful for me as a person who is bidding to work in the public sector, because it means I can tick off that I've answered the question. And generally speaking, it helps me use the word count. So there are lots of authorities that say to me, we've got a 500 word count. So on that particular question on care plans, one of the responses was, yes, we have care plans. And of course, it didn't answer all of the constituent parts that were in that question. So it's clearly not going to score very well. So breaking down the question can help, to help prevent fall foul of some of these common pitfalls. So hopefully that bit was helpful. So we've sort of covered grants and contracts at a super high level. What we do now, and I'm a procurement professional by trade, 30 years in. I've been working in the public sector as a provider for the last 10 years. I've run a social enterprise and a micro business, answering public sector bids. I know it's a complex area, it's challenging. And actually, if you're a small voluntary sector provider, it can feel dead lonely. In public procurement contracts, it's really tough if you want some help or support and some guidance, because the contracting authority has to do everything for everybody. And so there's a real focus in law on fairness, consistency, equity, all of those things. So Go for Growth is designed to try and help smaller organisations and the voluntary sector to be able to access the public sector. And it's not just about getting through bids, it's about delivering sustainable growth that makes sense to you and your organisation. So we're here to help to make it a little bit less lonely. We are fully funded, so we're engaged by BlueLight Commercial in this instance. And what that means is that any of the support that we deliver for you and to you is free of charge to access. It won't cost you anything. And effectively what we try and do is work out what the barriers are, and then help you to get over those barriers, and we help the public sector to learn about those barriers so that it's easier to access going forward. There is a little video link on the screen just for some more information about us as an organisation. And there's lots of ways to access that support. I'm not going to dwell on them. You can use our self-service platform. You can come to us on a one-to-one basis if you'd like to. We run events all the time, lots of training, lots of resources, guidance documents, checklists, templates, how-to guides, all of that grand stuff. And we are starting next month helping people to go through the standard selection questionnaire in slower time. So to make sure that you are compliant and you're ready, and also to demonstrate your capability or readiness to supply. We've got something called the Public Sector Supply Ready status. Again, all free of charge and light touch in terms of your time and intervention. So if you want to know further about any of the stuff that we do at Go for Growth, or you want us to give you a hand with anything, do just give us a shout, and that's where you can find us. There's some of our social media down the right hand side. That will take you to our events page, and the bottom one is our self-service platform. You can book with us through the calendar, and me and my colleague, our emails and our telephone numbers are on that slide. So please do feel free to use them. And last but not least, before we go for questions, I'm going to hand over to Andrew to talk about the VRP incubation and wider training needs.
Thank you. Thanks, Gillian. That was really great training. I think it's really helpful for people to see that. Basically, I just want to talk to you all for about 3 minutes or so about the VRP Incubation Hub, which I know some of you will know about. Basically, it's a suite of training we're working on. We worked really close with the Ending Youth Violence Network to create this suite of training, which means that hopefully a lot of our local VCS will help them professionalise, and it'll help them get everything they need in place to basically provide the best service possible for our young people and get the best possible chance of getting consistent funding, of getting those bids. Just a little whistle-stop tour of what we're offering. It has 3 levels. So the first level is minimum basic training, and that's stuff that usually you need to function, well, basically, stuff like safeguarding, diversity, those kind of stuff in that genre, stuff that you basically need to be able to consider for funding for those days and provide a competent service in our complex, diverse society. The next level is management training, and so that is more stuff like Jill was saying earlier about financial due diligence, making sure you have the responsible partners, making sure that your organisation is set up in the right way to be fundable and have all that, stand up to all that scrutiny in place. The third training is specialist training, and this is stuff that maybe not every organisation is going to need. So when I say specialists, it could be training, for example, cooking. If you're doing a food-based intervention, it could be sports safety if you're doing a sports intervention. So again, it's those more specialised things that probably help you fill your unique niche as an organisation and a practitioner. As well as the training offer, and again, this is a whistle-stop tour. I do have a proper full-length PowerPoint presentation on this if you ever want to get in touch with me. Other support we're offering is a community pot, which is basically a small bursary for our smaller VCS organisations for some training that we might not have thought of or say that you might need, but it's not big enough for us to commission at scale. So basically, we had one organisation come before that had a lot of non-binary kids in there, and and that had caused the staff wanted to know how to handle it. The kids didn't know really. Well, actually, in some ways, the kids were ahead because kids these days are quite cool with a lot of the gender things. Basically, everyone needed to have that refresher. and we need to be specific to their organisation. So we funded, we did a little process, and we got some training in for them to do that, just a bit tailor-made to their specific organisation, because they had specific not problems. But how do I say it, Jill? Challenges to overcome. Again, we have stuff that like today we have bid writing training and also bids and tenders training. So basically what we're offering you today, and that's stuff that isn't on our funding criteria but is good for those organizations to have, to make sure that you're sustainable. And then another example would be restorative resilience support. We've had that on offer before, so if you and your practitioners, again, this is for smaller organizations, so you probably can't afford their own restorative resilience support. So basically therapeutic support if you've got vicarious trauma, especially for frontline youth workers. That is something that we're offering. Our current contract for that with our provider has expired, but with that is a priority for those to get back up for the 2023 to 24 financial year. So watch this space. The best way to know about all of this stuff is basically being on our VRP mailing list. If you want to get in touch, email us at vrp.nots.police.uk, get on our mailing list, and then you'll always be the first ones to know about the training and support we're offering. Further in the pipeline, we've got as well the Violence Reduction Unit Community Hub, which will be a web page with all of this on, including the latest on local funding pots and local data and resources to help you write your bids. Now, there's been some delays with this, and I know the logo says Violence Reduction Unit. Do not let the out-of-date logo fool you. It's going to be the latest hot, up-to-date information, all just a click away for you all. Like I say, if you email us at vrp.nots.police.uk if you want any more information, I'm always available to talk to you. And yeah, I think that's everything from me for now.
Brilliant. Thank you ever so much, Andrew. We did get a comment from one of our attendees, Tanya, who would love a copy of the PowerPoint that you've talked about. So I think that Tanya is going to email you about that. So you should have an email in your inbox winging its way over to you.
Yeah, that's cool. In fact, I'll be proactive with it. If I might even send it to you, Jill, or if you're okay to share the emails with the attendees today with me, then I can send that to you all as a matter of course. And if you want more information, like I say, I'm only an email away.
Okay, that's perfect. That's brilliant. Thank you, Andrew. I think that would be really helpful for everybody that's attended today to have that presentation. So we'll do that. That's great.
No problem.
And that brings us actually to the end of the slide deck that we wanted to go through with everybody. If there are any questions, please do give us a shout on the Q&A. If there is anything that you think about as soon as we cut off today and think, oh, I should have asked that and I didn't, you've got our contact details. Please don't hesitate to get in touch. Or if there's something that you want to chat through, but you don't quite want to do it on the session today, that's not a problem at all. Just like I say, just get in touch. And I know how precious time is. So we are at 11:20 now. So if there aren't any questions left to come into the Q&A, all that would remain for me to say is thank you both to Roy and to Andrew for contributing so brilliantly today. Hopefully the session has been really useful for everybody that's come, and a massive thank you to everyone that's taken time out of what are no doubt very busy days to join us today. Hopefully it's been of use. If there's anything else that you would like to see run on a webinar like this, do let us know. We're always open to ideas. We'll work with BlueLight Commercial and NOTS VRP as well. So please don't hesitate to make those suggestions. We'd love to hear. But if that's it, sorry, go on, Andrew.
So I'll just reiterate, yeah, the VRP was exactly the same as you on that, Jill. Everything, I can't emphasize enough, everything we have and do as part of our training offer and our incubation hub has been requested by organizations like your own. I know it can be quite hard sometimes for public sector to be as responsive as we might like, but this is something we are very much by demand. You say we do. So yeah, get in touch with me and Jill. If there's anything you want else, and we'll do our best to get that for you.
No problem. And we did just get a question about where Go for Growth are based. So we're actually based all over. So we're a fully remote organisation. We pop up wherever we're needed. So and I have worked and lived in Nottingham. So Nottingham is an area that I know really well. So if we can work virtually or in person. So if there's anything you need, Tanya, just give us a shout. Cool. Thank you ever so much, everybody, for today. That's it from us, and hopefully we'll see you on a webinar somewhere soon. Thank you ever so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.